Welcome, Michael, and thank you for taking some time to chat with me today. Just to begin, could you describe your connection to Callander and the Callander Museum?
Absolutely. Well, I'm the son of Alex Dufresne. I'm one of three children, Mimi and Alex Dufresne, and Donald, my eldest brother, my sister, Elaine, who is also older than I am, and then me. I'm the baby of the family. We grew up in Callander, as did Dad and the family, and so we have been long-time residents here. And my professional career was away from the town, but I always thought of Callander as being my hometown, and so when I retired, I had a home built on the family property, and I moved back to Callander, and here I am.
Wonderful. So when we give tours to guests visiting the museum, we begin in the barbershop exhibit and explain that, they're standing in a barbershop because our museum started in a barbershop. Could you expand on that?
Yes, I can. The whole idea, Dad was really into history. In fact, I found a small notebook of his where he has dates when the first lights were turned on, and about Smith's Mill and all of these other things. He was really taken up with the history of any geography or any location, but particularly of Callander. And he was proud with this whole Dionne quintuplet thing and Dr. Defoe's part in it and Callander's proximity to Corbeil and everything that was going on there. So when he didn't want that to die, he wanted some kind of legacy to continue to kind of keep that memory alive to people, because it would be a terrible thing to have that fade away. And so, of course, in all this, Dad had the barbershop, and he had inherited the barbershop from his dad, who was also a barber, and Dad used to talk all the time. In his shop, he would have these pictures, these historical pictures of things, and he would talk about the importance of maintaining history in order to get a good perspective on the future, and try not to make the same mistakes that we often do. And so he used to talk about Dr. Defoe's house and everything else. And when it came to a point where I think they were actually, I'm not sure, but it could be that they were trying to, talking about tearing it down or doing something like that, Dad just said, no, this can't be so. We have to really think about saving that location and making that the physical memory, and perhaps, expand on that and build on that so that Callander has something that will be a reminder of those Dionne years. And that's how it started, and all the dialogues were done, of course, in the barbershop.
Okay. So then, did Alex have a vision for the museum and what he hoped it would achieve?
At first, the vision, of course, like all visions, it was a bit hazy. His end point was a very general end point, and that was to, as I said, to retain the memory of the Dionne years and the history involved in that. How he was going to achieve that, he was not quite certain, but he knew one thing, and that is that the barbershop would not hold all the memorabilia that he was going to be trying to get out there to ask for and to try to return. He had done a great deal of history on things that were kind of out in the community and outside of the community too, that had to do with Dionne's. And so he said, I have to have a physical containment for that. And so then his vision became, okay, if I get a physical containment for that, then I can start to put all these things that people can come and view, so that the people in Callander and their children and so on can have this as almost as an inheritance. And I can remember walking through Dr. Defoe's house when it was just totally empty with my dad, and watching my dad would go from room to room and his head would bow, and I could just see inside that in his head he was seeing things that I certainly could not see. It's all I saw was, oh my God, this is a real mess. And but that's not what Dad saw. And so I think that vision, a lot of that vision came through his own creativity. Dad was a very creative person. And, so I think that part of it, it was all in his head. And then as things started to come in, or starting to materialize, but the first thing he wanted was the barbershop, which was such an incredible, almost work of art. I mean, if you look at it, with all the marble and the urns and even the old chairs and the way it was done, he felt that should be part of that physical structure. He didn't know where it would go exactly at the time. At least he didn't tell me, but perhaps he did in his head.
The barbershop is absolutely a very unique aspect of the museum. So do you know how this decision to move the shop to the museum came about? Like, you've kind of alluded to it a bit here, but...
Right. Well, I've just found out some very interesting facts about that, too. Well, first of all, I mean, with my dad, it was amazing. We were taught that there's always a solution to a problem. And so I went to my dad and said, oh, this is absolutely impossible to do, or I don't believe that can be done. And it was almost like talking to Yoda. I mean, Dad would say, well, and that's why you're not doing it, because there's a solution to everything. You can always think of how things can be done. So his first point was to say, I'm going to have it moved. And then the dynamics of how that was going to happen, started to come through. Now, there was a transition because Maurice Turgeon was coming in and Dad had taught Maurice how to barber, trained him, and Maurice was coming in to take over the barbershop. And Dad worked for a while, interestingly enough, under Maurice. So, but Maurice wanted, of course, new, because he was expanding, to doing women's hairstyles and everything else. He wanted new equipment and things that were more appropriate to what his purpose was. And so I know that one of the barber chairs during that time went to my Uncle Homer, Dad's brother. And then Dad, wanted to get the rest somehow out of that. And by this time, of course, the museum was in place. Now, so when I say the museum, I mean Dr. Defoe's house had been purchased, or whatever the mechanism was, and so they were able to go through. I assumed that it had happened sort of after after Maurice decided that he was going to finish in Callander or something or other, but that's not the point at all. But it resulted because Maurice was getting all kinds of new stuff, and Dad wanted his equipment, into the museum. So it was he and Larry Carrier, my dad's neighbor, who actually moved everything. Larry just told me, I was on the phone, I spoke to him earlier this morning, that he had a truck and a big trailer, and he and Dad took things, almost piecemeal from the old barbershop into the museum. And of course, they had to be really careful because a lot of the marble was already cracked. And, over a period of time, they were able to move everything that was in the barbershop that Dad wanted moved into the Defoe house, now the museum, into the museum. And so that was news to me. I was amazed to find out that this was my dad's solution. Just call the neighbor and here we go. We just pack things up and we'll get things done.
That's really cool. I've always been curious, because you look at the barbershop and it just, the counters and the pillars and the mirror, and it's just like, how did they get this in here? Like, it's such an interesting thing. Precisely,
and as I mentioned, and I hadn't realized this until, I guess I did at the time, but I had forgot. But when Larry told me that it was Uncle Homer had one of the barber chairs, because all of this had belonged to their fathers. So Uncle Homer took one of the barber chairs. But when the museum, when Dad started to transport everything into the museum, then my Uncle Homer said, no, there's no way I'm going to keep this. I want it back into the shop where it was, in the first place. And that's how they got that's because now we have the two chairs.
Okay, well, I mean, that's most of the main questions, although I guess I did want to comment on when the gallery was added and the naming of the gallery. If you had any reflections on that.
Well, I'm not sure. If a lot of people are aware, but Dad was a very good amateur artist. I have a few of his works in my own collection here, and I love art. My wife was an artist and taught me how to appreciate art, so I have a house that has a lot of art that I thoroughly enjoy. Dad was a good amateur artist, and in fact, my sister's husband Tom was also an excellent amateur artist, and that's how he got in good with Dad before he late, was because they shared this passion for art. And so that I know that Morris knew about, and certainly some members of the community knew about. And so Dad loved art, and so to me it was just a logical, way to honor Dad was to name the gallery after him. Dad would not have wanted, as I'm thinking about it now, it would have had to happen after my father's death, because he was not that kind of person. He didn't want, he didn't want to be recognized for anything that he was doing. I mean, yeah, that he was involved, but Dad was very much, his context was teamwork. Even in the family, we were all a team. And so to him, he was instrumental in the museum, but he was part of a team. And he could not do things without it. He didn't know. Now that team could be the next door neighbor, or it could be, the people who were handling the bank, or Morrison's store, or whatever. But everything was about teamwork. So Dad did not really want any kind of credit at all. And in our hearts, we think he deserves that credit. He deserves it, and it does our hearts so much good to see that Dad's name is attached to the gallery. It has amazing shows, and Dad would have loved it. The whole art gallery aspect of it, Dad would have loved. And I guess that's about it. I was not here for the official opening. I know that my mom and my brother and sister were, but I was working on, and I could not be here. But I know it meant a great deal to the family to have that done. And is it possible for me to also just to add something that really doesn't have anything to do with this per se, but as I said, this whole thing originated, this whole museum idea originated because of Dad wanting to maintain the whole Dionne historical context. What a lot of people may not realize was Dad cut Mr. Dionne's hair, and he would be in there, and so Dad heard a different side of a story that is not out there commercially. I'm not sure. I haven't read the latest book. I've read almost everything else on the Dionne years, and there was a great deal of angst at the time for Mr. Dionne. They were almost seen to be as freaks, and the government took over so quickly. It was almost like ripping, a family apart, and in some way and in some context, the Dionnes were almost pictured as being the bad guys. And I can remember Dad empathizing and having great sympathy for this man who was just an ordinary man, and all of a sudden all of this was thrown at him, and then to be made to feel somewhat inadequate and wrong because of these 5 daughters that he had, something that you should be joyful for, but to be made to feel otherwise. I can remember Dad had great empathy for that, and I think that's one other reason he wanted the Dionne Museum, or a museum to maintain their memory. I think he believed he owed it to Mr. and Mrs. Dionne.
Thank you for sharing that.